The dream of diving into the deepest depths of the world is inherent to humanity just as much as the desire to fly. Until today, however, it shows how little men have accomplished with discovering the deep sea other than turning everything useful into a weapon somehow. Humankind always wants to fly higher and higher and not to fall down into the abyss our planet provides also quite literally. We explore space, other planets get visited, and the secrets of our universe get solved, all while 95% of our own oceans remain obscured by the curtain of uncertainty and ignorance, and this with more than 70% of our blue planet being covered with water. As if it was a scream metaphor for Christianity's belief in heaven and hell, up above are the gleaming beams of warm sunlight in the blue skies. In the depths of the oceans, it's cold, dark, and grim. Like the tale of Icarus, who burned his wings because he flew too close to the sun, the cold, dark desolation we fear of the ocean's depths, however, is found in space too, as a result of flying too high. Nevertheless, we can see the sky, while the darkness of deep waters gives only little insight. The desolation on high seas, with only water and sky to all sides, and the question what might lurk in that cold, dark, wet abyss under the boat, always sparked stories, legends, and yarn. Even today, our blatant lack of knowledge about the deep sea and its inhabitants makes it very much possible that some of this yarn might be a lot more truthful than we might have ever expected. For example, there have been rumors and legends about giant squids sinking entire ships. Sperm whales, some of the biggest animals on this planet, have been found scarred from fights with imprints of plate-sized sucker cups from the tentacles of enormous cephalopods. Even with all these hints, the Kraken stay the legend. In 1874, when the first photograph of a dead giant squid that washed ashore surfaced, and in 2012, when the first video proof of a living specimen was released, this legend suddenly became a truth. However, not only giant squids, other things may linger in the seas too, like the ningen, humanoid creatures that can grow up to 100 feet in length and live in the icy cold waters of Antarctica. Last but not least, there is also the mystery about the massive 10 feet tall female shark that in 2003 suddenly was eaten alive in one single bite, which sparked the search for the legendary megalodon. Therefore, who would really be wondering if yesterday's yarn would suddenly become a scientific proven truth in the blink of an eye? As I said, the need to turn everything into a weapon somehow is one of the curses of humankind. Aristotle already thought of and described the first ideas of a diving device. In the 7th and 8th century already first legends came up describing a military submarine of sorts, a submarine called Colymphus, meaning diver. Over the next centuries, many scholars, including Leonardo da Vinci, tried to construct a functioning submarine. Again, in 1653, a solely for military purposes created submarine was diving through the Canal of Rotterdam, built by a French named Descent. Generals like Napoleon further researched and encouraged a possible military use for these submarines. The first submarine that actually sunk another ship in combat situation was the CSS H.L. Hunley during the American Civil War on February 17, 1864. The submarine itself, however, was lost in that combat until it got recovered in 2000. With the success of the CSS Hunley, the appeal of military usable submarines spiked exponentially. More powerful engines and the ability to resurface without help ultimately made submarines viable military vehicles. But why did I tell you all of that? Because both these stories are about to meet in today's legend. At the end of World War I, a single submarine tacked along the Scottish coast in the Irish Sea near Maidens, SM UB-85, under command of Lieutenant Günther Krech. The refitted British sloop HMS Coreopsis II spotted the floating submarine on April 30, 1918, attacked and sunk it right away. The whole crew was rescued, interrogated, and then taken prisoners of war. The questioning of the submarine commander, however, was what sparked the legend surrounding the fate of the UB-85 up until this day. The most obvious question lies at hand. Why did the UB-85 not submerge when they spotted the HMS Coreopsis II coming for them? Lieutenant Craig supposedly answered this question with a story that could not be more perplexing and scary. UB-85 surfaced in the night between April 29th and 30th to recharge its batteries, when the water around the submarine suddenly foamed. When Lieutenant Craig and his crew searched for the reason of this foaming waters, they spotted a creature that they only until then could have imagined in their wildest nightmares, climbing the submarine on starboard side. A monster with a small horned skull, deep-seated eyes, and sharp teeth that were glistering in the moonlight launched at UB-85. The creature's weight alone caused a list of the submarine as it was attacking the front cannon. So much so that Lieutenant Craig feared that if the vessel gets tilted further, water would flow through the open conning tower hatch, sinking them. Thus, Lieutenant Craig ordered all available men to shoot at the creature, hoping they might be able to defend themselves. After some time, the men did repulse the monster by pure massive gunfire, but not before it was able to damage the submarine's front cannon and the foreship badly enough to make submerging impossible. Unable to submerge and defend themselves in a floating state effectively, the crew could only sit and wait for help until they got rescued by the HMS Coreopsis II. The Coreopsis II then sank UB-85 and took the crew prisoners of war, which the men were supposedly glad about, since it meant being safe from this monster. Günther Craig died in prison on March 5, 1919, without having seen his home and family ever again. What kind of creature could have been able to attack and damage a submarine that badly? Some insist on Nessie itself, the legendary monster of Loch Ness, or a similar creature that might have been responsible for the attack. Could it be that Nessie and its family took part in the war? Creepy truth? Or nothing but yarn? Loch Ness, since 1822, is integrated in the Caledonian Canal. This canal connects Scotland's east and west coast, which means that it is definitely possible for Nessie to leave Loch Ness southbound, heading for the Irish Sea. But should Nessie exist in the first place, it is most likely that a creature living in fresh water could not survive in salt water. Leaving this biological aspect aside, this thesis still is very unlikely. The Caledonian Canal is equipped with a total of 29 floodgates to compensate for the different water heights of the rivers integrated. Would Nessie have tried to swim through the canal heading towards the Firth of Lorne, it would have needed to pass 22 water gates to get there. A fate that a creature as big as Nessie would have been pretty much unable to accomplish, not to speak of the return back to Loch Ness. The thought of Nessie getting out of the freshwater lake, swimming through the whole canal into the Irish Sea just to sink a single German submarine, come on, that should be too much for even the most dedicated Nessie fans. But Nessie certainly isn't the only creature supposedly roaming the Earth's oceans now, is it? So what else could have been responsible for the attack on the UB-85? Over the course of several years, people supposedly reported many sightings of unknown monstrous creatures emerging from the waters around the proximity of the Firth of Lorne and the Irish Sea. I deliberately say supposedly here. I'll explain why in a few minutes. Some few people seem to believe that these sightings are related to an infamous industrial complex sitting in some distance to where the submarine was sunk. As a former NBC defense sergeant, I just could not ignore this idea for several reasons. The theory people put up revolves around the nuclear power plant Sellafield that became infamous for its repeated incidents and failures regarding work safety and environmental protection. The power plant is known to have pumped the radioactively contaminated waste directly into the Irish Sea, which was covered up more than once. I could go into detail about the radiation levels and the nature of the hazardous materials that have been used, but that would have just gone way too far. And it's not even needed, since everyone with a decent education should already have raised their eyebrows at nuclear power plant. The first commercially used nuclear power plant went online in 1956. Around 1900, it was only discovered that nuclear radiation exists at all. Any connection between the sinking of the German submarine and the nuclear power plant Sellafield is absolutely out of question. It is not even clear as to what the alleged creature was in terms of biological properties. The obvious lack of detailed description is strikingly obstructive. The few properties of the creature that Lieutenant Krech described make it impossible to draw a more detailed picture of the monster. A small horned skull, deep sunken eyes and glistering teeth. Nothing more is known about the creature. Nobody knows if it had tentacles, fins, or even mammal-like limbs. Its height can only be guessed by the story. After all, Günter Krech's description offers next to nothing. Especially if one thinks about the fact that people tend to compare unknown things to something they know to interrelate them, so it is very likely that Krech would have compared the creature to something known to provide a more detailed picture. But annoyingly enough, it is only bland details that have been provided, but not even a general idea of the creature's overall likeness, height, or anything. Suspiciously enough, the creature should have been very much visible during the attack. If anyone wants to argue that the night must have been dark, thus not giving much detail to be seen, I got bad news for you. The night of April 26th to 27th was a full moon night. This means that the night of April 29th to 30th was still pretty light, especially due to the moonlight reflecting on the water. This is, of course, only if the sky was clear that night, which is pretty fair to assume since Krech supposedly said that the monster's teeth were glistening in the moonlight. Plus, there is another statement that we will look into a bit later. This, in addition to the very vague and rather unlikely description on the monster, led me to believe that this is nothing but an internet legend, or an emergency lie told by Krech at most, to obscure the real reason behind the sinking of his submarine. But why should the commander of the submarine invent such a story? To answer this, let's first take a look at the person that was Günter Krech and the class of the submarine. Günter Krech was born on January 29th in the town of Althausen an der Weichsel and entered the Imperial German Navy as cadet with 19. Following a career as officer, he became ensign in 1908, and 2 years later he married Louise Kort. They had 3 sons, Horst, Günther, and Ulrich. His promotion to lieutenant was granted in midst of World War I in 1916. His first experience as a ship's commander gathered Krech on a torpedo boat, which was assigned to protect fishing boats. After that, he continued his commandment on other torpedo boats until he was trained to become a submarine commander between April and October 1917. Directly after his training, he went on the sister ship of UB-85, UB-86, to gather information. This was an important short-term stay for our following explanations. Submarines of the class UB-3, which involved the UB-85 and 86, have been a novelty. These were submarines with 2 hulls, built specifically for economic warfare. Submarines of this class have been equipped with 5 50-cm torpedo tubes, 7 torpedoes, and a 5-cm bored cannon. They had stronger diesel engines built in them to reach higher speeds than its predecessors. The subsequently higher weight was compensated for by installing fewer accumulators, which meant that they couldn't reach as far. It was able to submerge completely within 30 seconds time, where it could really show off its at that time amazing maneuverabilities. In 1916, the first submarines of class UB-3 were ordered by the German Empire. They have first been used for war in mid-1917 when the United States entered the war. This submarine class was brand new, so to speak, and not even tested in combat situations at all. SM UB-85 was ordered in the end of September 1916 and first launched in October 1917. The commissioning of SM UB-85 was on November 24, 1917, under direct command of Lieutenant Günter Krech. The mindful ones of you might already be clued in enough to have an idea about what led to the sinking of the submarine. A lieutenant freshman without any practical experience with submarines other than what he learned at the academy, and a brand new, untested submarine class. A constellation that could not have been any more spicy. Human errors or handling errors due to inexperience quickly come to mind thinking about the situation rationally. But it gets worse. Much, much worse. Like I said, supposed monster sightings in the Irish Sea have been a reason as to why people believe the legend about the sinking of UB-85. But no matter how deep I went, how much I tried to read up on the legend and how much I researched, I was not able to find any source proving any claims. No supposed monster sightings, and not even any source that proves Günter Krech spread the story of the monster at all. What I was able to get my hands on the other hand, are the original scans of the war diary of UB-85 as well as the original scripts of the crews and the lieutenant that stepped in after Craig's death as the commander of UB-85's testimonies when they returned from war imprisonment in 1919 and were interrogated by the Imperial Navy Command on the fate of the submarine. These testimonies not only draw a totally different picture of the legend, but of Lieutenant Günter Krech himself. It must be said that the war diary only covers the time between its launch on November 24, 1917 and April 16, 1918. Thus, they are the notes on the maiden voyage. Lieutenant Krech went on his second and last mission on April 16, 1918. There are no primary sources or notes on this second mission, since every document was sunken together with the submarine to not let the enemy get their hands on crucial information. This is standard protocol if apprehension by enemy forces or loss of a battle is imminent. Let's start with the submarine's diary. Apparently, the maiden voyage already was riddled with problems. The very first entry of Lieutenant Krech in his diary reads as follows. February 24, 1918, German Bight, Cuxhaven. March eastbound following High Command's orders. Approach was halted, fastened alongside Bosnia to repair main helm. The first problem already surfaced not far from its starting point. Later, it was found that because of faulty handling, the helm's mandrel suffered extreme wear, malformed, and thus led to the malfunction. The real source of the problem could not be determined and corrected by the inexperienced crew, so that a simple repair had to suffice at that time. On top of that, the crew got an additional training on the submarine class's specific difficulties in handling. After swapping out some bad elements, as Lieutenant Krech put it politely, the crew was deemed seaworthy enough to warrant a longer mission. The next documents state how after the submarine left for its mission, contact ceased and UB-85 never returned to the harbor. No documents after April 16th exist. The naval staff tried in vain to find out about the submarine's fate. Newspaper articles taught them about the sinking and imprisonment of the crew. At least 4 men of Lieutenant Krech's crew have been released from war imprisonment in 1919 and gave their testimonies. These testimonies consistently describe what really happened the day UB-85 was sunken. Let us start with the testimony of the lieutenant who succeeded Lieutenant Krech as commander, Lieutenant Wenninger. Report of the commander of UB-85. UB-85, dear maidens, on April 30th, around 4 a.m., bright moonlight, swell ratio 2, good sight, plenty of guards, crash dive, on course tacking guard ship. Helmsman reports tower hatch closed. In depths, water inrush through tower hatch. Closing tower and central hatches underwater impossible. Last compressed air was used to resurface. Strong gasification. Systems fail. Fuses broke, starting up oil machines fails. Vessel gets bow heavy. Artillery fire from guard ship impossible to return due to ammunition being underwater. Water level in submarine rises. Guards vessel rescues crew with rowing boats. Vessel and classified documents sunken below 80 meters depths. Successes: 29th of April, 12,000-ton steamboat with 4 masts, uncertain of origin, only heard British. Following British statements, attacked with air torpedoes. 1,000-ton steamboat submarine trap seemingly with submarine east of St. Kilda, from second tube with K3 on the water, seemingly detonated in the ground under the vessel. Tank 1 was flooded. England was exquisitely informed. Ask about dissolution of the command of Lieutenant Bathmer, Tower Building. Traeger's boats supposedly torpedoed canal. 3 men rescued, commander was not one of them. Attention! Prisoners are searched for notes and the like immediately after apprehension. 14 days London solitary confinement. May 15th, arrival of supposedly 3 officers, 83 crew members of newly sunken submarine. In the last sentence, it's most likely about 38 men instead of 83. 38 was pretty much the standard crew count. This typo is most likely due to a misread original document that was typed on an old typewriter using the old German font, when it was again typed using a more readable font. Since I do have both versions of this report, I can confirm this typo. The 3 and the 8 look pretty much alike with this font, and since the ink has a little bit smeared, it is very much possible that this is just a misread. The lieutenant is not the only one who describes the night short and simple. Another soldier, First Boilerman Probst, recalled the situation as follows. Bremen, November 14th, 1919. Back from English war imprisonment appears First Boilerman Probst from UB-85, I will leave out his home address here, and states the following. On April 30th, 1918, at 2:30 a.m., we did crash diving because we were attacked by destroyer ships. At the depths of around 60 meters, the tower hatch suddenly leaked and massive amounts of water entered the boat, rendering the electrical machines and pumps useless. By the help of compressed air, it was possible to get the boat back to the surface. Since a new attempt at diving was not possible due to the water in the submarine, and the English attacked us with destroyers and trawlers, the vessel was sunken by our commander and engineer. We had been taken up by English trawlers and brought to London. The whole crew was rescued. In London, we were questioned. Treatment and food were bad. 4 weeks later, we were transported to POW camp in Fongor, North Wales. There, treatment and food were bad too. In July 1918, I was transferred to the POW camp in Lee. Treatment was better there. Read out, approved and signed, Probst. Happened as above, signed Sharpen, Reserve Ensign and Head of Department. Helmsman Reserve mate Franz Buchholz tells about the night with the following statement. Wilhelmshaven, November 23rd, 1919. Back from English war imprisonment appears Helmsman Reserve mate Franz Buchholz from UB-85. I will leave out his home address again, and states the following. On April 16th, UB-85 went from Heligoland to the Irish Sea. At the early hours of April 30th, after crash diving was practiced throughout the night, the lock on the tower hatch failed to close. The vessel sunk to a depth of 20 meters with open hatch. Compressed air was used to resurface. The boat was nearly up and down again, only due to the utmost engine power the submarine was able to remain on the surface. After the vessel surfaced completely, it was able to float on its own again. An English trawler was called, which immediately opened fire. UB-85 suffered an immediate underwater hit. Shortly after, 5 more trawlers arrived, which took parts of the crew each. The submarine was sunken by commander and helmsman. We were sent to London to be interrogated and stayed there 18 days. After that, we were sent to Camp Frankach. Read out, approved, and signed Buchholz. Happened as above, signed Bücking and signed. Even with these small inconsistencies on the time of the event, everything still seems like it was all due to a technical issue. A defective hatch on UB-85. A very possible scenario since it was an untested submarine class. What throws this thought out of the window completely, however, is the testimony of First Boilerman Julius Gottschemmer. Wilhelmshaven, September 29, 1919. Back from English war imprisonment appears First Boilerman Julius Gottschemmer from UB-85. You know the drill with the personal information that comes now, and states the following. On April 30th, 1918 at 4 a.m., the tower reported a hostile vessel heading towards us. Immediately crash diving was initiated. Because of the hectic situation, the tower hatch was not closed properly. It flung open on a depth of around 12 meters and water entered the submarine. It has to be noticed that heading from the tower through the hatch of the Central Command Unit, a cable was laid to power the second compass, and another one from there through a bulkhead to power a radiator in the officer's quarter. These cables have been laid on the order of Commander Lieutenant Krech. In my opinion, laying these cables was unnecessary because there already have been standard installation options for powering the compass and the radiator. Thus the water was able to flow into the central control room and the officer's quarter unhindered, where it caused a short circuit in the accumulator battery, which was installed below the officer's quarters. This rendered the submarine unable to drive underwater. We have been at the oil machine with 17 crew members. Since the boat got increasingly stern-heavy, I wanted to get in contact with the speaking tube and the central command room. As I opened the speaking tube, water poured out of it, and I was sure that the central command room was underwater. Nevertheless, we tried to open the bulkhead leading to the central command room, but failed to do so. In the moment water was able to get from the central command room into the machine section, we were able to get to the tower and then to the surface. We were able to hold on to the bow of the submarine until the sighted English vessel came up to us to pick us up. This took about 1 hour and a half. The English ship, a trawler, had attacked us in this situation additionally with artillery fire. The vessel was sunken in the last moment by opening the front hatches. Read out, approved and signed, Gottschammer. Happened as above. Signed, signature, Lieutenant. So let us summarize the whole traceable situation. Around 2 o'clock in the morning, UB-85 lays dormant on the water. It is bright, the sea is calm. The crew was practicing crash diving all night long. Enemy vessels get spotted. The training became reality for the first time. The tower hatch gets closed but not sealed shut properly. Water breaks into the tower and can flow unhindered through the central command room and even further due to the cables that were laid on behalf of the commander, preventing the sealing of the tower from the rest of the submarine. The submarine becomes unable to move underwater. UB-85 gets stern heavy. The last compressed air and the power of the diesel engines bring the submarine back to the surface one last time. The bow sinks and makes it impossible to return the fire coming from the English trawler, the HMS Coryopsis II, that approached UB-85. The crew can get to the air, where they were rescued by the enemy and brought into POW camps. In the meantime, the commander follows standard protocol and sinks the submarine and every document within it to not let the enemy get their hands on either one of them before he too gets captured. Instead of a monster or a simple mistake, these testimonies show a totally different reality, one in which the commander in particular gets no redemption. The order to lay a cable through the hatch of the tower, which must be sealed airtight under all circumstances when diving, and another one through the bulkhead, only to secure his privilege of a radiated room for himself, even though this bulkhead too must be sealed shut in a situation like that, and all that even though there already have been standard options to do this safely. That's just absolutely irresponsible and unforgivable for a commander. Comfort was of higher priority than safety, than the lives of the crew. As an experienced military superior myself, I absolutely cannot see any reason for such an order to be given other than sheer ignorance or even unknowing. The convenience of a single man was more important than the safety of everyone. Did Lieutenant Krech make up the story of the monster attack to avoid getting ridiculed for this ignorant stupidity which led to the sinking of his own submarine? Whether Günther Krech told the story of the monster or not cannot be proven at all. Since he and his crew were transported to the same POW camp in London, him telling such a story is pretty improbable though. His comrades would have definitely heard about that and lost every bit of respect for their commander, since not only did he sink the submarine and nearly cost their lives, but then did not even account for his mistake, and instead invented a fantastic fairy tale to cover up his ineptitude. Besides that, they most likely would have set the whole situation right away, or at least not joined this charade. As usual, I want to take some preemptive action to counter possible arguments that could occur. If Lieutenant Krech is dead and his war diary lies on the bottom of the Irish Sea, how can I be sure about the sailors telling the truth and the testimonies not being a huge cover-up by the Imperial German Navy's High Command? First of all, they make sense. I know from personal experience that some officers just use their privileges to their advantage over other soldiers and try to enforce them without shedding a second thought. The wish to install these cables through the hatch and the bulkhead to power second compass and radiator seems to be a very replicable mistake. Crash diving was trained all night long, and even before this standard maneuver was trained again and again. Lieutenant Krech was most likely sure about the tower hatch getting shut correctly every time by then, thus not leaving a practical reason to shut the second hatch leading to the central command unit and the bulkhead to his quarters too. Second, the overall situation. Krech's inexperience with submarines in general and the problems of a whole new and inexperienced crew and technology which just added to the probability of mistakes happening. And of course, the similarities in the crew members' testimonies regarding the events make so much sense. They all tell the same story, but still differ enough from one another to show that every sailor lived through this event on his own and perceived it on his own. These testimonies have been filed under top secret too, locked away just as long as every other document of this classification. If this was a ruse, why would they have gone through this hassle at all? Third, UB-85 was equipped with a radio and could have called for help or signaled SOS after the attack rendered them disabled and adrift, instead of just sitting there waiting for something to happen deep in enemy territory. Even a warning about enemy movements or special threats like the supposed monster in the vicinity of the submarine would have definitely have been worth a radiogram, don't you think? Even if radio silence was ordered, I believe that this situation would be enough to warrant an exception to get rescued, even if that would have meant imprisonment. It could not have been worse than to be crushed by a giant sea monster. But not only the radio was an option. The damaged forecastle and front cannon made a dive as impossible as an effective defense by cannon. The engines were still working though, so what kept Lieutenant Craig from just leaving the area? Higher visibility was something every other ship had to deal with too. At least trying to get out of there was a more obvious strategy than just sitting there and waiting for basically anything to happen. Wasn't it even worth a try? Plus, the alleged fight with the monster was absolutely confusing to me. If the weight of the creature alone was enough to let Lieutenant Craig fear the boat getting so much list that water might be able to get into the tower, ultimately sinking the submarine. At that point, the submarine must have been at such a heavy angle that I find it hard to believe that the men were able to run around, let alone fight on the surface of that submarine. Especially with no one falling overboard. The creature seems to only have had eyes for the submarine, but not for the men who were attacking it. Craig's supposed story tells of a handful of men with rifles and handguns fighting off a giant monster that was able to destroy hull and cannon effortlessly on a shaking and rumbling submarine that gets tossed around permanently, lying on a near 90 degrees angle in the water. And not only they can fight off this monster, but all this without a single man being injured at all whatsoever. Forget about the assault troops, the crew of SM UB-85 were the hardest motherfuckers ever. Excuse my sarcasm, but if someone thinks about this story for a little longer than just half a second, and does not write off the lack of information on specific things as unrecorded or part of a cover-up more than enough still remains to be more than just skeptic about this whole legend. All this lies in combination with the lack of detailed information on the monster's properties, the lack of evidence for the supposed frequent monster sightings around where UB-85 met its fate, and the fact that there are no primary sources telling about this attack. There are only articles retelling something by hearsay decades after the supposed attack happened. In my opinion, there never has been an attack by a sea monster at all. There was only an accident provoked by an ignorant, inexperienced lieutenant that led to the distress and ultimately the sinking of the SM UB-85. And all that without any kind of cover-up story too. A pure internet legend that could not stand against an investigation that went beyond pure blind belief. But what do I know? Maybe the truth really does not lie in the official archives? Sometimes reality can be more fantastic than any fiction. Günter Krech himself proved that another way. Günter Krech's son, who had the same name as his father too, became a Navy lieutenant and commander of a submarine in World War II. Günter Krecht Jr. too only commanded one single submarine in his whole career, U-558. Although he was more successful than his father, Krecht Jr.'s submarine too was sunken on July 20th, 1943, and he, like his father, was imprisoned. As opposed to his father, he survived his imprisonment and was able to see his home again. Günter Krecht Jr. died in the year 2000 at the age of 86. Life has some odd ways, don't you think so too? Until next time, sweet nightmares.